Hey folks, this is a very different video than any that I've ever made before because it's several hours long and most of the video is of other people. The majority of the footage comes from the April 14 and 15 meeting of the Central Coast Water Board that was recorded on the CalSpan network. Now there's links in the video description where you can access the full recordings there. And what's here is specific to the technical panel that I was involved with at the beginning of the meeting on April 14th. So that technical panel was focused primarily on the cover crop nitrogen credit, but it also includes some details with the nitrogen irrigation water issue. It was fun and an honor to be part of that amazing team of speakers on the technical panel. Now, I made this for 4 reasons, really. First, because I wanted to be able to remember what happened and easily navigate this historical record. I consider this video kind of like raw data that, the change in the cover crop nitrogen credit is based on. Now, if you read any of my research papers, you'll know that I'm a big fan of showing the raw data. It's a great way to make your science more transparent. So raw data can be messy and variable, and that's the reality, and that's important, and that's okay. So anyway, just keep that in mind. Now, the second reason I made this is to share some of my own reflections on this historical regulation. Third was to save people time so that you don't have to, go, if you want to just look at the cover crop parts, which is what mostly interested me, you don't have to go through 16 hours of video over 2 days to try to figure out where you find that. And the last reason really was to make the video more accessible to people because it's on YouTube. Okay, so let me start by giving you a little bit of an overview of how you can easily navigate through the different parts of the video that interest you. So in the video description, there's a clickable table of contents to the specific parts of the video. So I've also added a little title box up here at the top, which will indicate the different sections and what they were each focused on. The video also has some relevant links to publications, like I mentioned one book during my presentation and also one of my papers, where you can access those. Now, if you're interested in sharing your thoughts or questions that you might have on the cover cropping part of the ag order, feel free to add a comment to this video. Who knows, you might even want to make your own video of your reflections. And if you do so, I'd love to see that. You could put that in your comment link or just send me a link to that. All right, so a little bit on my reflections from this past week as I participated in and listened to this adoption hearing of the ag order. It was without doubt the most suspenseful and hopeful several days that I've gone through in my 20 years working at here in Salinas Valley. It was suspenseful because it was relatively unlikely that we would succeed in what we were trying to do. Our aim was to try to increase the cover cropping nitrogen credit. And one of our team members described it to me using a baseball analogy that I wanted to share with you. They said that basically it was like being at the bottom of the 9th inning. We needed to get the bases loaded, and then we needed to have a home run. But our main batters didn't know how to hold the bat. That was, in other words, it was a long shot, whether or not we'd succeed or not. Now, there were also some funny parts, like when I mistakenly assumed that one of the board members was a medical doctor, and I used an analogy to try to discuss this issue of the challenges with a one-size-fits-all approach to the nitrogen credit. So that the credit that was in the original order was this 30 pounds credit for a cover crop, and we argued that that wasn't science-based and the one-size-fits-all wasn't a good approach. In any case, it all turned out well. Our team succeeded to convince the board to increase the nitrogen credits for cover cropping, or at least give the growers an option using a science-based argument. I really consider this to be a win-win for all of us involved, from the technical panel folks that I participated with to the board and the staff and all the stakeholders. I think it's a win because it ensures that the ag order will help to incentivize cover cropping and therefore reduce nitrate leaching into our groundwater. We should celebrate that win as collectively. All right, now, right after my colleagues and I finished our interaction with the board on Wednesday, that was the first day, that was April 14th, we got an email from another colleague who said, "Well done, everyone. Who knew a regulatory board meeting could be such a nail biter?" Now, there were definitely some suspenseful and nail biting type moments. You know, for me, it started off when I couldn't get my microphone to work at the beginning of the meeting, or at the beginning of my presentation. And it appeared for a few seconds that I would actually not be able to speak with the rest of the team. This is pretty ironic and somewhat kind of an ironic and humbling glitch for a do-it-yourself scientist videographer like me, because I consider myself, you know, relatively savvy when it comes to computer video and audio issues. Now, thankfully, the board was patient, and I was able to quickly figure out the problem and then proceed. But if I hadn't solved that problem, it really would have thrown a wrench into our entire strategy, because our team had carefully planned the order of presentations, and we were referring back to the previous presenters. And I was the second presenter of 5 focused on cover crops. So I'm really glad that that audio issue didn't hinder my ability to participate as we had planned. There were also some nail-biter moments during the time when the board was asking us questions. And then also late on Thursday, right before the order was voted on, there was some confusion about the wording of the carbon to nitrogen ratio requirement that I had suggested during my presentation. Thankfully, the board chair allowed me to give input, and the corrections were made, and I greatly appreciate that and all the hard work that the board staff and others have done to incorporate all these changes and come up with this complex order. Now, there are a few non-science reasons that I think that our team succeeded in convincing the board to increase the nitrogen credits above the 30-pound per acre limit that they had initially set them at. The first thing is that our team worked well together. We had a very consistent and unified message, basically that the nitrogen credit needed to increase, and we were just focused on non-legume cover crops. So I think that was something that was nice and clear, and you know, we weren't getting off on a lot of tangents. I also think that it helped that each of our individual member presentations augmented each other and bolstered each other. You know, we would often refer to the presenter prior to us. Now, to help with this, we had actually shared our presentations among our group and got, you know, lots of feedback early on. It was a great team effort. Now, there were also people behind the scenes who didn't present but provided really important input and feedback to us. For example, here's a list of, you know, several of the people that I discussed my presentation with. Now, there are several things that really struck me and I learned from this whole process. One of the most important ones was how science communication needs to be more of a dialogue, more of a two-way flow of information, rather than just a one-way flow that originates with the scientist. This is something I've been learning a lot about over several years, and I've also been, you know, I've been doing that as I've learned to make videos and, you know, really work to become a better science communicator. I discussed this in some detail in this recent opinion paper that I wrote that you can access to if there's a link in the video description. In that paper, I discussed this so-called knowledge deficit model that's very common among scientists who incorrectly assume, like I used to, that giving people more information will convince them to change their mind, whether it's about, you know, climate change or vaccines or whatever issue. What's intriguing is that the research actually on science communication shows that what's often really needed is to integrate stories into science communication and then work to try to get dialogue, you know, a two-way flow of information back and forth. That's what I tried to do in my presentation, and maybe that helped us to sell our case for increasing the nitrogen credits. Of course, if you really wanted to test that, we'd have to do an experiment to prove it, and we'd have to replicate it as well. I'm just joking. Anyway, I understand that many stakeholders have concerns about this regulation. I also do, but I'm also confident that based on the science, we need something like this to address our water quality issues. And I'm confident that the regulation will continue to improve, as we stay engaged in dialogue. For example, here's one area that I'd like to see maybe figured out in the next several years here. I would like to figure out a way that farmers that grow legume cereal mixed cover crops, so for example, a mixture of, rye mixed with vetch, could be able to get some nitrogen credit for the nitrogen that was scavenged in the non-legume components of the mixture, like the rye part. Now, I understand this is a complex issue because there's legumes in there also, and those legumes are, they're fixing nitrogen through biological nitrogen fixation. But there is strong evidence in the literature that basically says that, or has found that mixtures can actually do both. They can both fix nitrogen and scavenge nitrogen. So we didn't get into that issue in our discussions with the board this past meeting, but I think this would be something that would be, this is one that I'd like to see considered going forward. Now, this is my first time and sort of experience participating in the regulatory process. My part was pretty minor, and I wouldn't really consider myself a big player in this. I was just a small piece of one of many people. But what this all made me appreciate was all the important behind the scenes, stuff that must go on in regulations that are being developed that affect you and me every day. Regulations on complex issues like climate change and, healthcare and all these other things. My hope is that the positive parts that I saw happen over the past week here also happen in these other situations. I don't know all much about the process prior to this last meeting, but from what I saw this past week, I was very, it gave me a lot of hope and confidence in this process. Now, in closing, I should mention that in the video description, there's a link to the pre-recorded version of my presentation that I gave on the first day, it was April 14th. And that pre-recorded version has much clearer graphics than you will see in the Zoom recorded version here. So it's the same, follows the same basic script as what I used here, what I presented live to the board. Although the last part where I mentioned this important kind of last minute 11th hour phone call the night before I presented, that wasn't included in that pre-recorded version. Now, in that pre-recorded version, I actually acknowledged two people that I consider pioneering cover crop researchers in the Central Coast, specifically Richard Smith and Louise Jackson. Both have done amazing work in this area, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. But, in retrospect, I also should have paid tribute to a few pioneering farmer friends of mine in this region, people that I dialogue with regularly and who have been critical in my journey to understand cover crops and how we can use them in these systems. The first person is Phil Foster. Phil was the one who grew the carrots that I used in my final graphic of my presentation. I hope you like that graphic. So I got the tasty, both those carrots from his farm. The large carrot, that was how the carrot looked when I bought it. The other one was a smaller carrot which I had put in the microwave and dried down so that it didn't look very good. Anyway, I ate the nice looking carrot, the one that wasn't dried in the microwave, right after I photographed it. Now, Phil and I have done several trials over the years, and we've really enjoyed sharing ideas about cover crops over the past 20 years. Now, another farmer that I should mention is Jim Leap. Jim worked at the UC Santa Cruz farm there for several years, and after that he also worked with me at the USDA in our long-term research experiment for several years. Jim was a mentor to me when I first started working at the USDA, and he really helped me to understand how to use cover crops and deal with some of the equipment and things in these systems. Now, as well as a lot of other great exchanges of ideas and things like this. Now, lastly, the other farmer I want to mention here is Roy Fuentes. Roy's been a friend of mine since 2011. And Roy has been critical in our collaborative research efforts at the USDA Agricultural Research Service on strawberry research since 2011. So Roy, along with Jim Leap, have both been instrumental in my efforts to work to try to develop and then define or refine, I should say, ways that we can grow cover crops in strawberry systems to reduce runoff. Thanks for listening to my reflections, and I hope that you find this video helpful and interesting. Take care.
Proceed, Mr. Keeling. Thank you, Mr. Young.
Thank you, Chair Wolff. Okay, so I am going to now turn it over to Harvey Packard and Katie DeSimone to start bringing our speakers in. I would just like to note, though, that we've already lost our first speaker, Michael Cahn. He had an appointment that he already had scheduled this morning, and if we didn't get to him by 9 o'clock, he wasn't going to be able to make it. So we will slot him back in later today in an appropriate time when he is available. I just want to announce that. And so,
Mr. Keeling, Mr. Cahn still is on, and he is number one. So if he'd like to speak, we could let him start. I guess we can leave that up to him, but I have promoted him to panelist, and Michael, you can start if you would like.
Yeah, I think that would be best. So
okay,
get filled in. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So first, Chairman Wolff and members of the board, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I wanted to just focus on Pathway 1 in the Ag Order for estimating nitrogen discharge, and particularly the term AIR, which is the amount of nitrogen applied in the irrigation water. And in the revised order, it's based on the volume of water required for crop evapotranspiration. And this was a recommendation I gave in the fall workshop. So I'm happy to see that was adopted. I do want to get into more detail on this as a follow-up, and see if I can get my cursor to work. There we go. So first I wanted to address how can growers most easily estimate crop ET, and then a special situation if a grower is applying less water for their crop than estimated crop ET, because in that case they would be held accountable for water that they didn't actually apply. So I think we might have to make a little change to accommodate that situation. So for vegetable growers, they have potential challenges in estimating crop ET for their farming operations because they farm many fields, many plantings that they have to track during the growing season. They grow many types of commodities, and they plant at different times of the year. So I want to just make you aware of some example online tools that growers could probably easily use for estimating crop evapotranspiration. The first is OpenET. It's a new product that's online or coming online that uses satellite data for estimating what we call potential crop ET as well as actual ET. IrriQuest, another product that's sort of a hybrid of satellite information as well as weather station data. And then CropManage, which was named in the Ag Order, which is an ET-based irrigation scheduling tool that uses the CIMMYS weather data. So before I go into detail on those tools, I just wanted to mention the California Irrigation Management and Information System, known as CIMMYS, because many of these tools rely on CIMMYS for getting ground-based estimates of what we call reference ET. And there's over 150 active stations throughout California. They monitor solar radiation, wind speed, relative humidity, and air temperature. And most of these, there's stations in most of the agricultural regions of California. And the data is provided online to growers. And then through their website, the data can automatically go into other applications. I also want to just clarify some of the terms that are used in discussing evapotranspiration. We often talk about reference crop ET, and as you saw, those stations are located or sited on what's called a reference crop, which is supposed to be a well-watered, full-covered grass or alfalfa field or pasture. And so with that reference crop, we use what's called a crop coefficient, or KC, to relate that reference crop to the crop of interest based on the species and the development stage. In that way, we can calculate what we call a potential crop ET. So this would be potentially the maximum water the crop would evapotranspire at that stage of development. And then there's another term called actual ET. Actual ET is when we estimate the amount of water the crop is actually evapotranspiring. And we can do this through several methods. There's the soil water balance method, there's weighing lysimeters, and probably the most popular is called the energy balance system, which uses instrumentation out there in the field to measure that. And then dividing actual ET by the reference ET, we can actually determine what the crop coefficient is. So we can relate all these terms together here. So the OpenET is a new online platform, and it serves 11 Western states, and the intention is that it would serve 17. It's a NASA-led collaboration among universities and institutions, and Forrest Melton is the principal leader on that. Utilizes Landsat and Sentinel satellite data, and has a spatial resolution about a quarter of an acre, and it provides monthly estimates of potential crop ET as well as actual ET. And there's plans for it to provide daily, what we call gridded ET, reference ET, and forecasted ET estimates. So I'm just going to reshare my screen to, let's see if I can get this to work. So I could just do a really quick demonstration of it. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So this is the OpenET tool, and it's going to be online in July. So you're getting a preview, but you basically, this is the Paso Robles area, I believe. And if you zoom in for any field, for this is the year 2016, you can see the seasonal actual ET estimate here. So, and it gives the estimate also of what type of crop is being grown there. So we can move across here. So very quickly, a grower could find out their seasonal ET number. And there's hope that they would also allow growers to draw the boundaries of the ranch so they can, in sort of one shot, get an estimate for the entire ranch, what their seasonal ET is. And if you click on this, you can also see it monthly, over the years, and cumulatively, and all that data can be downloaded. So I'm going to stop sharing that and share the screen again. Okay, so hopefully you see the presentation now. So another tool is called AirQuest, also developed by NASA, led by Lee Johnston, and it is used for estimating field level crop ET, and it uses a hybrid of satellite data as well as models of crop coefficients, and it uses weather data from the CIMA stations, and it can address a large array of commodities. It will be available online in November, although it's already available as a downloadable spreadsheet. And then the third tool is Crop Manage. This is an online irrigation nutrient management decision support tool. So its purpose is really to provide decision support on how to best irrigate and use nutrients, particularly nitrogen. And it was developed by USDA-ARS Cooperative Extension, which I was involved with. It's mainly limited to vegetables and berries, although we're expanding it to trees, vineyards, and some agronomic crops such as alfalfa.
Dr. Cahn, you have 1 minute left.
Okay, well, let me just zoom across so I won't go into too much detail. And then there's some, I guess, commercially available equipment available, such as the Thule technologies can measure directly ET in the field, and there's commercial satellite products. I just want to address this last point, calculating AIR when applied water is less than ET. When would this apply? When we have significant amount of rain, such as in the winter periods. So growers would apply actually less water than ET, or deep-rooted perennial crops such as vineyards and apples, where the crops are making use of deep moisture in the soil that's stored from winter rains. So we would recommend just making an adjustment in this AIR calculation to include both the ET or applied water, whichever the grower chooses. So this would be the change that we would need in that definition. So either one would work, and in most cases in vegetables, the growers would choose to use crop evapotranspiration, but for vineyards, tree crops, they probably would want to use volume, which is the actual water they're applying with their irrigation system.
That's time. We're actually a little bit over.
Okay. Thank you.
And so with that, we'll move on to our next presenter, who's Richard Smith. Richard, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and begin your presentation. Thanks.
Okay, I guess, all right, here we go. And good morning, everybody. And I'm the Vegetable Crop and Weed Science Farm Advisor here in Monterey County. And I also want to thank the board and Chairman Wolff for allowing me to speak today. And I also want to thank the staff and the board for the modifications that they made to the revised draft order in the recent draft. And that's all been very, very positive and science-based and much appreciated. There is one lingering issue that I want to talk about today, and that's the credit that's been granted to the use of cover crops. It's 30 pounds per acre, and we feel that's inadequate. The suggestion that the cover crop needs to be removed to reduce the nitrate leaching in order to get the credit for the the nitrogen that's contained in the cover crop. We believe that's a misunderstanding of the role that cover crops play in providing a critical source of carbon to the soil that enables the microbes to build up soil organic matter levels, as well as improve nitrogen cycling and retaining nitrogen as the organic matter levels can be increased. And what we've measured over the years is, typically cover crops take up 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre in this coastal area, and that the appropriate credit would be tied to this cover crop nitrogen uptake. And if we just take a look at a crop production system without cover crops at the end of season A in the fall, we have tillage of crop residues, and at the end of this crop cycle, what happens is that the soil nitrate levels begin to rise as mineralization of the crop residues and mineralization of soil organic matter occur in our soils. Don't get cold enough to stop mineralization. So we'll see soil nitrate levels increase to 20, even up to 40 or more parts per million. And then we go into the rainy season with these fallow beds, and you can have unmitigated nitrate leaching at that point, depending on the weather pattern. And then when you get to season B in the spring, the following spring, soil nitrate levels can be low as a result of that leaching. And then the growers need to put on a robust fertilizer program in order to make up for that. But if we include a cover crop in this scenario, the same process occurs at the end of the crop season. The soil nitrate levels continue to rise, but the cover crop should capture that nitrate, sequester it in its crop biomass, and then bridge it over to the subsequent spring. And then any mineralization that might occur at that point can be measured by the use of the soil nitrate quick test, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But in this situation, this leaching is then mitigated. But if we look at what that cover crop is doing, it's scavenging nitrate from the soil, sequestering it in its crop biomass, and any mineralization that happens in the following spring will be based on the carbon-nitrogen ratio of that cover crop. But the important point here is that the cover crop, it's increasing infiltration of low nitrate containing water. And so this is really, I think, the whole thing that we need, and I think supersedes any other concerns, because this is what we need in this valley, is infiltration of low nitrate water to help dilute and resolve our nitrate leaching issues. But if we look at a real careful evaluation that was done, published by Louise Jackson in 2000, where she grew a cover crop, and the cover crop, the nitrogen in the cover crop was tagged with N15, which this facilitated the tracing of the fate of the cover crop nitrogen. And so what she did is then they grew a lettuce crop following this cover crop, and then followed the fate of that nitrogen from the cover crop. And what she saw, the most important thing you see here, is that about 60% of that cover crop nitrogen remained in the soil organic fraction. This is the humus material that's non-leachable. She measured about 20% got into the lettuce crop. Of course, always some in the microbes, some inefficiency in terms of leaching. There was about 5% leaching, and then an unexplained fraction, which possibly was due to denitrification. But the important point is that it's adding to this organic fraction. And so in the letter that we wrote, we were requesting that the nitrogen credit for the use of cover crops be increased, and there was concern about leaching from the cover crop when it's incorporated into the soil the following spring. And the point that we'll make here is that, that nitrogen that's incorporated with the cover crop, it really, whether there's mineralization occurring, depends on the C to N ratio. And because cereal cover crops, which are the vast majority of what's grown here, at about 90 days, you typically have a C to N ratio of about 20. And this is, at this point, we start to see immobilization of nitrogen. So rather than release of nitrate to the soil, we actually see an immobilization of the nitrate. And Eric Brennan will talk about that in more detail. And the point that from my perspective and all the work that I've been doing with nitrogen management is that regardless, even if there is mineralization from the cover crop, that nitrogen can be measured. and it can be accounted for with soil nitrate testing. And then the soil nitrate testing is then used to manage fertilizer applications in the following lettuce crop. And the soil nitrate test that we've been working with for the last 25 years, it was introduced into this area by Tim Hartz, and we've been working with growers to increase adoption of the use of nitrate testing. It's a very simple process. It can be done by the growers. It's a quick process. You can get the results rather rapidly and inexpensively. And it's measuring the residual soil nitrate from whatever source, whether it's from mineralized from soil organic matter, prior crop residues, cover crop residues, leftover fertilizer, whatever the source is, it integrates all that information into one measurement, which then gives you an actionable piece of information that you can make fertilizer decisions. And here's just an example. For instance, residual soil nitrate acts just like fertilizer, and if you have levels in the soil of 20 parts per million nitrate nitrogen or more, this is sufficient to maintain maximum crop growth for approximately 2 weeks. And the way growers use this information is if sufficient residual nitrogen is present and they're getting ready to make a fertilizer application, what they can do then, if they have these levels that are like 20 parts per million or so, they can either reduce the fertilizer rate that they're planning to apply or even forego that fertilizer application. So it's a very powerful tool. In fact, it's our most powerful tool along with irrigation management in terms of managing nitrogen during the production season. And just the final point that I want to make is that I also have been doing research on these nitrogen removal coefficients.
1 minute left.
Thank you. What we see is that this R value is always going to be less than the A value. For instance, a lettuce crop might contain 150 pounds of nitrogen. That's what it contains at harvest. That's not necessarily what's applied. But the removal is typically less, in the range of 60 to 70 pounds. And so it creates this dilemma for the growers, in which is going to become more acute as these targets and limits start ratcheting down to, for instance, 300 pounds. So cover crops provide the growers a credit of the nitrogen that if given this credit of what they take up and cycle, this can help growers comply and will incentivize the use of cover crops, and then help the growers comply with these targets and limits that they'll be faced with.
That's time.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm done.
Great. Our next speaker will be Eric Brennan. You have 10 minutes, so you can start your presentation and unmute yourself. Thank you. We're having a hard time hearing you, Eric. Is there a problem on your microphone end?
Let me see here. Is it real low or is it somewhat low?
It's very low, very, very faint.
Okay. Give me just a second. I'm going to try connecting a different mic.
We actually can't understand what you're saying.
He's trying to move to a different mic. So
Gotcha.
we can just maybe give him a minute. Well, 10 seconds.
Still can't hear you.
He's working on it.
Would you like us to move to the next speaker and then we'll come back to you?
Yeah, I'm not exact. Can you hear me at all right now?
That's
hear
a
you,
little
but
better.
Yeah, it's very faint. Unless you're going to be doing a lot of projection, it might be helpful to move on to the next speaker so you can figure out your audio.
Okay, while that sounds fine to me. I apologize for this. I didn't know that would happen. But why don't you move on to the next one? And
Well, now we can hear you.
now.
If you're projecting your voice like that, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, that sounds great. All right. Well, all right. So let me, can you just tell me when you want me to start? That way I'll kind of
Go ahead.
start.
You're good to go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I'm going to focus today on why and how cover crop nitrogen, the credit needs to change to reflect the science and ensure success of the ag order. I look forward to your questions, and I hope you can just wait till the end to answer them. Now, I put a YouTube link at the bottom here because after my presentation, I'll actually make sure that my part is a pre-recorded version where we put on YouTube so you can easily see it and review it. Okay, so I'm going to actually use this timeline to tell you a story. And it begins about 20 years ago when I was in a hotel room in Salinas on the night before I interviewed for the job that I now have. I didn't know much about commercial scale vegetable production, and I thought that cover crops might be important in that. So I was reading this book, Cover Crops for Clean Water. Clean water. That's really what the ag order is all about. Fast forward, I got the job, and after about 15 years of conducting short-term and long-term trials on cover crops on many different aspects, I asked myself the question, can we grow vegetables sustainably without cover crops? And I addressed it in this paper. It's a complex question. And after about 10 pages, I concluded that the answer is no. That's why I'm here really to talk with you today. Fast forward to last year, I received an email from the staff of the Water Board asking for input on the ag order. I had 2 very good meetings with them, and I remember one of the first things I told them staff was, I was glad that it was their job to come up with this complex but very important regulation, not my job. I appreciate the effort that you've put into this. Fast forward to January of this year when the revised ag order was made public. That was the first time that I read it in detail, and I have to say that I was extremely impressed with how comprehensive it was and how much effort you'd obviously put into it. I would give you an A+, but I have to say that I had some major concerns about the cover crop parts of it because I didn't think that they reflected well on the science. And in that regard, I'd give you a B- or maybe even a C. Now, that's why I'm here today. I want to help you get the cover crop part of the ag order up to an A+ so that the ag order can succeed. Okay, so in February, myself and several of the colleagues wrote a letter expressing some of our concerns. Fast forward to just last week, we received the response to our comments, and it was discouraging because one of the most important suggestions that we had was to increase the credit for cover crops, and that wasn't accepted. Now, I would actually give us an F because of our inability to convince you to increase the credit. I understand why you were concerned about the potential nitrate leaching from a cover crop residue once it was incorporated into the soil. That's an important issue which we should have addressed in our letter. So I started thinking, how are we going to deal with this? I was getting emails from different people asking me, what are we going to do? And I said, you know what, let me just think for a little bit. So I went back to the ag order and I looked at it very, very carefully. And all of a sudden, I felt like I got hit on the head and a light bulb went off, and I could not believe what my colleagues and I had missed. Let me tell you what it was. So this is a table from the ag order that shows the scientific basis for the discount factor that's applied to organic fertilizers. It's the basis for a very, very simple metric, the carbon to nitrogen ratio that Richard just mentioned. Now, we've known for decades that the C/N ratio of a material, whether it's a cover crop or an organic fertilizer, is an excellent predictor of nitrogen mineralization and release into the soil. It's also a really good predictor of leaching risk. Let me explain this with a little bit of long-term data with a rye cover crop from one of my experiments. So on the horizontal axis, we have the C/N ratio, and on the vertical axis, we have the nitrogen concentration. Now, as you look at this, you can see that as the nitrogen concentration goes down, as you slide down that curve, the C/N ratio goes up. You can also see that the cover crop, as it develops from the red dots in December to the yellow and then to the green dots, the C/N ratio goes up. Notice that the C/N ratio is greater than 20 when the green dots are, when the cover crop is more than three months or older or so. Now, this number of 20 is important because it's kind of like a tipping point. Because when a material has a C to N ratio greater than 20, it's not likely to leach nitrogen. Whereas a material with a C to N ratio less than that is more likely to leach. So now let me show you how we can use this information to determine a scientifically sound credit for cover crops. Okay, so these are the two existing requirements in the ag order for cover crops to qualify for the nitrogen credit. The first one is focused on growing the cover crop during the winter when the leaching is most likely to occur. And the second is focused on getting enough biomass to scavenge a large quantity of nitrate that would otherwise leach into the groundwater. Now keep in mind that what we're talking about here are non-legume cover crops like rye or mustard. Okay, so to reduce the risk of leaching from a cover crop residue that's incorporated, I propose that we add a third requirement, and that is that the C to N ratio of the cover crop shoots has to be 20 or greater. Okay, now I'm going to take this information and I'm going to walk you through how we can use this table that's already in the ag order. There's no change needed there. This figure that I have showed you today, and then this proposed change with the C to N ratio to pull all this together. Okay, so we're going to start up at the top. Now let's assume on the top right, let's assume that my proposed addition requirement of the C to N ratio 20 or more has been accepted. I'm going to show you how this would work for a cover crop that has 4,500 pounds of dry shoot biomass and a C to N ratio of 20. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to determine the nitrogen in the cover crop, how much was scavenged and prevented from leaching. To do this, we go down, take that C to N ratio, we go down to our calibration figure, and we can see we go up to our regression curve and take a left, and we get over to the side, and we see that there's 2% nitrogen in that material. So 2% of 4,500 pounds of biomass gives us 90 pounds of nitrogen in the cover crop shoots. Next, we go over to our table, and we need to determine the appropriate credit based on a C to N ratio of 20. Now, you might notice that the table only goes down to a C to N ratio of 15. That's okay. We're going to use that as the discount factor because it's actually more conservative. And we do some simple math and the simple calculation, and what we determine is that the nitrogen credit should be 97% of the cover crop shoot nitrogen uptake. So for this example here with 4,500 pounds, that would be 87 pounds of nitrogen credit. Folks, that is scientifically sound, it's defensible, and it's extremely conservative. And perhaps even more important, or just as important, this is a carrot that will incentivize cover cropping and ensure that the ag order will succeed in reducing nitrate leaching into the groundwater. Now, let me summarize and be real clear here, because there are two things that I think the board needs to do. First, we need to require a C to N ratio of 20 or more. That's kind of, that adds additional safety into our requirements. And the second thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we follow the process that's scientifically sound that I just walked you through right there for determining this credit. Now, if we do this, this will transform the way that the ag order can have an effect on taking up nitrogen.
1 minute.
Thank you very much. So this will transform the way that the ag order can take up nitrogen and solve this issue for us. Without cover crops in the system, all the work you do on nitrogen fertilizer reductions or management, irrigation, those are important. But think of the cover crop like a third leg on a stool. Without cover cropping, we cannot grow vegetables sustainably. And without cover cropping, we cannot deal with this leaching into the groundwater. One part of this story that was very exciting was last night at 10:30, I got a call from Louise Jackson. Louise is the pioneer in cover crop research for this entire region. She was so excited when I went through this scenario with her. She said it makes sense. It also makes sense to Daniel Geisler, who is the top nitrogen mineralization expert for the entire state of California. I talked with
Time,
him.
Dr. Brennan.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you.
And with that, our next speaker is Karen Lowell. Karen, you can go ahead and begin your presentation.
Ms. Lowell, you're on mute.
There. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. My name is Karen Lowell, and I'm an agronomist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm also a certified crop advisor. I'm going to stay on the theme of cover crops in my comments. Both NRCS and CDFA Healthy Soils Program offer incentives to plant cover crops, but money hasn't been enough to get past the legitimate concerns that growers have. It's undeniable that cover crops have tremendous benefit for reducing sediment, nutrients, pesticides, and surface water. Just drive around in a winter storm and you can see it. Groundwater benefits may be less obvious, but they're equally well demonstrated in the data. The state of Maryland saw data from lysimeter studies documenting that up to 95% reduction of nitrate leaching under cover cropped fields, and groundwater nitrate levels falling from more than 25 parts per million to less than 5 parts per million over the 8 years following addition of winter cover crops. So Maryland pays growers to put cover crops in, and it's worked. In the 2017 Census of Ag, Maryland has the highest percentage of any state of cropland that's cover crops. They're at 29%. NRCS knows cover crops work too. Our conservation stewardship program will actually pay growers to plant cover crops for the explicit purpose of scavenging nitrogen vulnerable to leaching. And keep in mind, NRCS doesn't pay for things that we think will work. We pay for things that we have solid evidence will work. So regulations are another way to try to drive change for public good, and they're most effective when they're evidence-based. I hope you will follow the evidence that Richard and Eric have offered and increase the allowable credit for cover crops. 30 pounds is not supported by the data. As Richard noted, and Eric, when the allowable nitrogen application rates drop, growers will need the nitrogen cycling capacity of cover crops. Appropriately crediting the cover crops in the regulation is critical to overcome the reluctance to use cover crops. Cash hasn't been enough, but adding evidence-based flexibility to hit the mandated nitrogen applied limits could really be a game changer. You have a really unique opportunity to drive change here. We know how to use cover crops to manage nitrogen. The evidence is really clear. Cover crops protect water quality, and California needs a Maryland-scale adoption of cover cropping. You can help us get there with good evidence-based regulations. For the good of all the stakeholders you serve, I hope you will embrace the data that you've been offered today from our group and others. And the money is there, but we need more. We need that big carrot that Eric just showed you. You can give it to us with a well-crafted order. I really appreciate all of your reception of all the input you've been offered and your efforts at really trying to get this as right as it can be. And I thank you very much for your time. I will stick around in case there are any questions for this part of our group's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, our next presenter is Sacha Lozano. So you can unmute yourself and begin your 3 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity. I speak on behalf of the Resource Conservation District of Santa Cruz County with 10 years of experience working with growers in this region. My comment also relates to the R scavenge component of the A-R equation, and specifically to the limit imposed on the maximum credit allowed to nitrogen removal from cover crops. So as promoters and facilitators of voluntary adoption of conservation practices on farms, RCDs rely on partnerships, technical expertise, scientific knowledge, and incentives, very importantly, to support growers in improving the environmental outcomes of their management practices. We fully support the arguments that my colleagues from UCCE, USDA-ARS, and NRCS have just presented. Recycling nitrogen and preventing its leaching through the use of cover crops and other nitrogen scavenging practices is possible, as scientific research evidence has demonstrated, if careful attention is dedicated to adequate management of crop residues, irrigation, and timing of crop and cover crop planting and harvest cycles. We can work with growers to help them advance adoption of cover crops, to measure soil nitrogen and inform their fertilizer application. As been mentioned, growers have a legitimate concern which prevents broader adoption of cover cropping. And it is hard for us to convince a grower to adopt a practice when on the one hand, we're trying to argue in favor of what is possible based on science. And on the other, they may realize that no matter how hard they try, their efforts won't be sufficiently recognized. So including the R scavenge component in the A-R equation and highlighting cover crops as part of it.
1 minute.
It has created an important incentive, but setting an arbitrary cap at 30 pounds per acre as the maximum allowable credit almost cancels the incentive that has been created. So with all due respect, I would like to consider this maximum allowable credit for cover crop removal based on all the evidence that has been presented to you. And as Karen said, we have an opportunity here to create a powerful incentive to accelerate adoption of a management practice that has multiple environmental protection benefits. And I certainly hope we can make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And with that, our next speaker will be Kelli McCune. So Kelli, feel free to unmute and begin your presentation.
Great, thank you. Board Chair and members of the board, my name is Kelli McCune and I work at Sustainable Conservation, a California nonprofit that takes a collaborative approach to achieving environmental goals. Thank you to the staff and board for your thorough review and thoughtful comments in response to our letter about recognizing cover crops for their nitrogen scavenging capabilities. My comment today is based on the 12 years I've spent working to develop incentives that can motivate farmers to achieve water quality and quantity outcomes. I know that incentives are important to the staff and board, and I appreciate your efforts to develop incentives in the order which are needed to drive landscape scale change. The recognition of cover crops as a nitrogen scavenging practice shows that you want to support increased adoption because of their role in taking up nitrogen in the soil that would otherwise be at risk of leaching during the winter. But currently, it is not enough of an incentive, and we have a long way to go. Estimates in the Salinas Valley of cover cropping each winter is 1 to 5% of the farmland. Why is the adoption rate of cover crops so low since it is not a new or unknown practice? In short, cover cropping poses business risk for the farmer. While NRCS and CFA offer funding to help offset the cost of implementing a cover crop, you have the opportunity to incentivize specifically the scavenging of nitrogen in the soil during the winter. I am not asking you to fund cover crops, but rather recognize a science-based amount of nitrogen scavenged by using Dr. Brennan's proposed C/N ratio method, instead of the 30 pound per acre credit, which is not tied to published research on cover crops. As Richard Smith described, cover crops do a service during the winter by capturing nitrogen that
1 minute.
That is already in the soil, meaning the grower does not add a new input of nitrogen. We recognize your concern about the spring mineralization of nitrogen when the cover crops are incorporated in the soil. It's a good question, and we the C/N ratio method presented by Dr. Brennan addresses those concerns. Therefore, we strongly support using the C/N ratio method to calculate the credit, since it is evidence-based, consistent, and fair with how you are recognizing organic fertilizer and compost by using C/N ratios and associated discount factors in the order. Please take the unique opportunity you have to motivate growers to adopt cover crops, because we cannot wait another 5 years to recognize this scientifically sound solution for its critical importance in addressing the nitrate leaching problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for the presenters in this technical panel. So at this time, I will ask each board member if you do have, specific questions, clarifications that you may ask our staff, and and having further discussions on what you heard. And so I will go through each of my colleagues and give you one opportunity, to comment or make suggestions, and then we will wrap up based on the input of everyone. So who would like to go first? I'm looking for hands.
Dr. Hunter, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I have a very simple question, I hope. I am moved by the testimony and the detail, the technical information. I really appreciate the efforts and thoughtfulness coming to us at this decision-making point. My question is, if the 30 pounds per acre is not sufficient, I'm not clear on what the recommended number would be. So perhaps someone can respond to that.
Go ahead, Dr. Brennan.
Yeah, can I respond to that? So the recommended number is not a one size fits all. So right now it's 30 pounds. What we are recommending is actually, it's a percentage. So on that slide where I use the discount factor in the table, the recommended number, which is, it's a very conservative number, is actually 97% of the amount of nitrogen that has been scavenged and taken up by the cover crop and is in its shoots. Now that's important to mention that it's conservative because I used a C to N ratio of 15, not of 20 or greater. If I use a C to N ratio of 20 or greater, which is often what a cover crop will be when you take it down, the credit would actually be greater than the amount of nitrogen that the cover crop took up, because the cover crop is actually, when you incorporate the residue, it's actually taking nitrogen out of the soil to decompose. So the real number here is 97%. And that, what's beautiful about that is that a grower whose field is taking up more nitrogen and therefore creating a greater benefit to reducing leaching into the aquifer would get a greater credit. So it's just like Dr. Hunter, you're a medical doctor. You understand one size never fits all with people. It never fits all with many different systems. That's the exact same system in what we're working at here. It depends on the system. So 97 is the number there. Thank you for that great question.
Thank you for that clarity. And just for the record, I'm an anthropologist, but we do recognize, we do have quantitative and qualitative analysis. So I'm aware of and I think in this order, we're looking for data driven, we're looking for evidence based, and certainly looking at numerics and creating an understanding of how critical numerics are for farmers to gauge and have risk reduction and rely on certainty of known dynamics. So that is very important. And thank you for answering that so succinctly. It's very helpful to me. That's my question. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I apologize. My dad is an anthropologist also.
Oh, okay. We're in the family. Thanks.
So look like Mr. Young.
Thank you, Chair Wolff. So Dr. Brennan, appreciate your presentation. It's very helpful. Maybe you can help clarify maybe any misunderstanding I may have as to the use of cover crops. Would we want to make sure that we limit cover crops to species that will not be drawing nitrogen from the air, so that we can ensure that they're actually scavenging from the soil?
Mr. Young, your point is well taken, and obviously you've all paid attention to this. That's a critical thing. So we're talking about here is non-legume cover crops. So we're not talking about vetch or fava beans or peas. we're talking about rye or mustard or barley or oats. We're talking about things that do not have the ability to fix nitrogen. In other words, take nitrogen out of the air. We're just talking about things that have amazingly fine root systems that go down there and just pull up all that nitrogen. So that's a very important distinction. And that's what's most important here is we're focused just on the nitrogen capturing ability of non-legume cover crops, which, you know, for 95% of the Salinas Valley, that is the most appropriate type of cover crop. I get calls every year. Eric, what type of cover crop should I use? First question I ask is, what was your previous crop? What soil type is it? In most cases, in the Salinas Valley, we have a nitrate problem because we don't grow enough crops that scavenge nitrogen deep in the soil. And a legume cover crop won't solve that problem. It'll actually contribute to it. We need things like rye, mustard, oats.
Great, thank you very much. So Chair Wolff, at some point, I would like staff to be able to weigh in and give us their opinion on what we've heard from the technical panel, because I think it deserves some discussion as to whether the 30 pound per acre is the right one to use and whether we should not make some type of an adjustment based on what we've heard using a C to N ratio.
Correct. And
so whenever that's appropriate.
Yeah, my plan was to have the rest of our fellow board members ask question, comment, and then the last step was going to ask staff to comment, because then they benefit from all the input from both the speakers and also from board members as well, to maintain good efficiency. So at this time, I would like to ask Mr. Johnston if you have any question or comments.
Certainly, a couple comments. First of all, Chair Wolff, I would just suggest, since 4 of the 5 people on the technical panel were talking about one subject, cover crops, and our first panelist, Michael Cahn, was talking about a completely different subject. Just for clarity's sake, maybe we can circle around when we're done talking about cover crops to talk separately about the evapotranspiration questions that Michael Cahn raised.
Well, I was hoping that my fellow board member would have brought their questions on all the speakers and not having another round of going back to every single board member and separate this item. I thought I made it clear to ask any input and comments associated with this technical panel as a whole. I'm trying to maintain some efficiency here.
That's fine. We can talk about both things at once, if that's the preference. So the question I had from Dr. Kahn's presentation then was, well, I didn't have any trouble with the concept of, in certain sounded like limited situations, infrequent situations where there was a heavy rain year and less water was applied than needed for evapotranspiration, or where we were talking orchard or grape crops that are drawing from groundwater, and there's less water applied than is needed for crop evapotranspiration. That concept made sense. The only question I had, and I believe we've lost Mr. Cahn, was what about in situations where there is significantly more water applied than is needed for crop evapotranspiration? And I understand part of the point was of including this evapotranspiration rubric was that water needs to be applied, for example, right after transplant, and that nitrogen is simply not available to the crop. But I was thinking specifically of flushing in tile drain situations where water is being applied to in excess of what's needed for evapotranspiration to flush the soil to avoid dealing with salt buildups. And it was just a question I had outstanding. I don't have a problem with the concept of saying the lesser of the evapotranspiration requirement or the actual nitrogen applied, pounds of nitrogen applied based on water applied. As to the second set of questions on cover crops, I had a couple of questions. One was, I believe we just heard from Mr. Brennan that really the his sense was that this applied to non-legume cover crops, to crops that do not fix nitrogen. And so one question was, is a proposed change, does that adequately specify that? My second question was, do most of the commonly used cover crops that are non-nitrogen fixing have a carbon to nitrogen ratio in excess of 20? And my third was trying to understand if the proposal is to, and this kind of follows up on Dr. Hunter's question, if the proposal is to eliminate that 30 pounds per acre credit cap or to modify it. Those were my questions, and I have to kind of hold my comments as to whether I think they're good ideas or not for purpose of board consensus until I hear answers.
Mr. Johnston, thank you for those good questions. Can I go through those one at a time? So the first question, I believe, was, just say that again, just so I get it. And I'll answer that one, then we'll go to the next one and the next one.
Oh, now you're going to ask me to remember my questions?
Well,
the first one was directed to what Dr. Cahn said. Do you want to hear that one?
No, that one I'm not qualified to answer that.
Okay.
I'm only qualified.
So the first question was, you made it clear that your comments really applied to non-nitrogen fixing crops. Does the order as written or the order with a proposed change of specifying a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 20 or more adequately ensure that it's not being applied to nitrogen fixing crops?
Yeah, the order as it's written right now does specify non-legume cover crops. So I believe in that regard, there's no problem. And it's very clear on that. That's important. So that's not an issue.
Okay.
But yeah, so that one's done, I think.
The second question was, is what is being proposed to eliminate? Well, no, the second question was, do pretty much all of the commonly used non-nitrogen fixing cover crops meet that standard of carbon to nitrogen ratio of 20 or better?
That's an excellent question. So we have a long-term study that's in its 18th year right now. And if I refer back to we have a 8-year data set. We grew rye as well as mustard. And on average, we can easily meet that C to N ratio of 20 or greater for both of those two non-legume cover crops. So that's not an issue with non-legumes. It's just a matter of knowing at which point you hit that kind of that magic tipping point, and then it's ready to take them down. So that really isn't an issue. That's very, very achievable.
So there are not other commonly used non-legume cover crops that don't meet that 20 to 1?
Not that I'm aware of, no. As far as I know, all the data I've seen, we can always hit that number.
And is what's being proposed by this panel the elimination of a cap on the credit, or a modification of cap on the credit?
My suggestion is that the 30-pound cap right now is not based in science, and so I couldn't defend that. So what I'm suggesting that it be replaced with is a number which is not a one-size-fits-all. It depends on the situation, and it depends on how much cover crop, how much nitrogen the cover crop took up. So if we go with that C to N ratio approach that I'm saying, and a grower took up 100 pounds, it would basically get 97% of that as a credit. If a grower only took up 50 pounds, they would only get 97% of 50. If a grower took up 200 pounds, they would get 97% of 200. So it's not a one size fits all, and it's sound. So what I don't want to see happen is that there's a lot of other. We want to make sure the ag order has got no technically, scientifically sound, scientific flaws to it. And a major flaw I see in it right now is that the 30 pounds is not based on anything that I can understand. All I understand is it's 10% of the discharge number of 300. But why wasn't 25% chosen? Or why not 50% or 5%? It's an arbitrary way to determine a metric, and it's just not a good way of capturing what the cover crop is actually doing. The way I've proposed bases it on what the cover crop actually took up and prevented from leaching. And so I would propose it's a complete change of way of thinking. And I apologize that I didn't see this. My colleagues didn't see it. That's why I give us an F for our first attempt. This is our second try.
Okay, so let's keep a process going here. I see two, and I know Mr. Johnston, you still have the mic, so to speak, but I see the hands raised of Ms. Lowell, who may want to supplement something, and then Mr. Keeling, and it would be great to insert those two raised hands in the conversation. So if you don't mind, let's hear from Ms. Lowell.
Can I just prompt maybe Richard to address that C to N question? When we discussed this as a group, what we were noting is that if you keep those crops growing 30 days, that is some assurance. And above ground biomass can be an estimate of the nitrogen uptake. Richard, did you want to touch on that? That we were not suggesting that the part of the discussion in the order be overlooked, right? It's important that you keep that 30 days of growth and that you use the above ground biomass as a proxy for estimating the nitrogen you've taken up.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the order it's actually 90 days is what they modified it. They were at 120 days and then they modified it to 90 days. And then yes, then you use this the nitrogen uptake, which as it turns out, all the years we've been working on these cover crops, we've never really done a correlation between nitrogen uptake and the height of the cover crop, which is a very simple way for the grower to be able to estimate how much nitrogen, because we don't want to create some onerous thing that the grower has to go out there and do all the sampling. So we're working on that right now, actually developing a correlation between height of the cover crop and nitrogen uptake. And that should provide a simple method, for the growers to be able to get this estimate of nitrogen uptake. And then, Eric is proposing this discounting it by 3%, and that's fine. I think that is, like he said, a conservative approach.
All right, thank you very much. So at this time, Mr. Keeling.
Thank you, Cheryl. Hope you don't mind me coming in. I do have some questions. I just want to say this is a really great conversation. I appreciate the work that you're all doing and the new analysis that you put forth with respect to your proposal. I'd like to start off by saying that, staff developed that 30-pound credit initially as an incentive so that we could start incentivizing cover crops to the extent that we thought was appropriate based on the information that they had at the time, fully acknowledging that it's not a permanent removal. It is a cycling within the nitrogen system or nitrogen cycle for crops. We just wanted to have more assurance based on research and data that shows that, yeah, it is sequestered for the long term. It does provide benefit to reduce subsequent amount of fertilizer applications for the crops that come in the spring. And so I have a couple of questions. The first one is, as I understand it, you're suggesting that as part of this new proposal based on the C-to-N ratio of 20 or greater, that there would be an analysis of the dry weight biomass nitrogen of the cover crop used to calculate what that credit would be based on the percentage, say upwards of 97% based on that C-to-N ratio. The other is are you also recommending, and what I'd like to see is that along with that, there would be criteria associated with soil nitrogen testing to confirm what is available and somehow to document the amount of reduced fertilizer nitrogen application, subsequent to that cover crop, so we can actually see that in the balance moving forward.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Keeling. And at this time, I would like to move on a little bit, okay? So next, I would like to check with Mr. Johnston if you had any more question on this technical panel at this time.
Well, yes, I just have another comment. I was thinking along the same lines in some of a part of what Mr. Keeling said, which is, my concern all along with this, as with the organic fertilizer credit, has been that we're certainly sequestering nitrogen. We're certainly putting it in a space where it is going to be mineralized more slowly. It's going to be, but it's cycled. It's still there. It allows that credit would allow the grower potentially to use more fertilizer without exceeding the targets or limits that are contemplated in the order, so I like the idea in terms of what it does in the short and medium term. I like it for reducing winter leaching of nitrogen residue from the previous crop. I like it for the soil health and for the fact that the nitrogen is going to be mineralized more slowly. It's also possible, though, that because we are essentially allowing a credit here, well, I guess if we're not doing legumes, that we're not really introducing any new nitrogen into the system. So yeah, I don't have a problem with this concept, I guess, is my contribution to consensus on this. And since we're covering both questions together, while I retain a concern about in terms of Mr. Kahn's comments about what happens when excess water is applied over evapotranspiration for purposes of flushing, that really doesn't speak to Mr. Kahn's comments. I do not have an objection to Mr. Kahn's proposal that in circumstances where less water is applied than the evapotranspiration requirements of the crop, that we allow the irrigation input to be based on that lesser number. That's all I got.
Okay, So thank you, Mr. Johnston. Mr. Young has his hand raised, but I, don't want too many back and forth right now. So I still want to hear from Ms. Gray. I still want myself to have the opportunity to speak. And when we totally wrap up, then Mr. Young, if you want to supplement something, we'll do that, because I still also want to hear from staff beyond the executive officer himself. And I would like to also caution that, this is a public comment period with board engagement, and I would like to avoid this to morph into a workshop on crop applications. So at this time, I would like Ms. Gray to provide us input.
Thank you, and sorry for the interruption in my service. So I feel like this is all extremely compelling information, and I am somewhat disappointed that we're just getting really to have this conversation now. Cover crops are extremely important, hence the reason for inclusion in our ag order overall. And to the extent that we can include this as an optional compliance pathway, I'm comfortable. I feel like we're a little bit at a loss with sort of the timing of this and our ability to really cogitate on it and understand the ramifications. So those are my comments. I feel as if we need to include any sort of incentivization that we can, particularly as it relates to cover crops. They need to be utilized as they are efficient. And I appreciate, Dr. Brennan, your conservative estimates on this. I'd like to understand a little bit more on opportunity for, an optional compliance pathway associated with that formula.
All right, so thank you, Ms. Gray. So my comments and input. First part is with Mr. Michael Cahn in regard to ET and the use of ET to identify water use. And I would like just to insert a reminder that ET is not the sole exclusive tool used by farmers. Soil moisture sensors play a very important role, and I want to make sure we don't lose sight of that. And soil moisture sensors technology likewise have made great progress, both permanently installed soil moisture sensors and portable moisture soil sensors, and the latest technologies utilizing electrical resistivity with time domain reflectometry, is certainly state of the industry. Mr. Cahn brought up a lot of the, latest technologies and science available. So I want to make sure that we didn't lose sight of the importance and the value of measuring directly soil moisture. Regarding Mr. Brennan comments, since we were given letter grades, I will give you a letter grade. Specifically to your graphics creativity, so I will give you an A+ for your graphics creativity. Credits where they're due. In regard to the pounds, 30 pounds, certainly I would like to hear more feedback from staff, but I could see some potential benefits of not limiting ourselves to a value, particularly if that value does not have good science. However, caution is the unintended consequence of making an order even more complex. I think we all can recognize and agree that this order has added a significant amount of additional requirements for growers compared to the Ag Order 3.0. So on one hand, the benefit, yes, let's let's become a little more accurate. But there's a point also when we are on the quest of high level of accuracy. The higher level of accuracy we're looking for, the higher level and increased level of field measurements, calculations are going to be required. So that's going to be my red flag caution, is on one hand, say, okay, let's take a different approach. But the other hand, now adding other requirements, well, you're going to have to measure the height of your cover crop, and then becomes a question of what's the average? Well, and I know well that soil is not uniform. So you're going to have some areas where your cover crop, on class 1 soil will be much taller than another section. Even if the amount of rainfall is the same, obviously, on a farm. So then we get into all these variations. So how do we calculate the average? So I'm not being a naysayer here. I'm just saying, from a practicality, the farmer eventually is the one that's going to have to do all this, or his farm advisor, his or her farm advisor. So I want to make sure that whatever we do is not, in the sake of accuracy, adding a significant amount of additional burden to the grower. And then let's remind ourselves that ultimately the water board staff, is going to be reviewing information. Otherwise, if we're doing just, fill out the form and it becomes just an exercise, it's pointless. So that's basically at this time my comment. And I appreciate all the presenters, being here today and making time for us. So at this time, though, let me ask our staff to comment, and then we'll go back to the hand raised of Mr. Young and trying to bring this to a closure. Again, as a reminder, it's 10 past 10, and I said this morning that I was going to be a little tenacious in making sure that we keep ourselves on time and not penalize other portions of later speakers' engagements by taking an extraordinary amount of time on one particular item. So Mr. Keeling, I'll let you introduce staff response, please.
Ms. Saul, if you're ready, I will turn it over to you to engage on this topic.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Keeling. So first I'll start off by saying that staff's incorporation of this ARS scavenge credit was really to provide a credit for the management practice of cover crops. It was not to discount the nitrogen in the cover crop itself. And that seems to be where these comments are headed, is that it's the discounting of the nitrogen applied via the cover crop. And that was not our intention at all when staff incorporated this ARS scavenge credit. Again, a credit for the management practice for growers that are implementing those cover crops or those high carbon amendments. So that's my first point. I would also add that our total nitrogen applied data that we have been collecting for the past 6 years, even though growers have been implementing these cover crops, they've been reporting on cover crop data in these total nitrogen applied reports, we are not seeing that growers are taking the nitrogen in the soil, the testing of the nitrogen in the soil, and using that to reduce the amount of nitrogen that they're applying. So based on that information, we're still seeing that nitrogen is potentially leaching even when there are cover crops in place, even when that management practice is being used by growers, because growers are not accounting for the nitrogen that's in their soil, or after subsequent crops, or after the cover crops are reincorporated into the soil. It was mentioned, and staff does have a concern that if we were to move down this approach of using the carbon to nitrogen ratio as part of the R scavenge credit, that we would need to collect more information. And this would require more staff analysis, more staff follow-up with growers, specifically as it relates to yield information from that cover crop. We've talked about the height of the cover crop. That's also some information that Mr. Smith had mentioned, that they're still conducting some more research on that, and that seems to be ongoing. And we've posed some of these questions, some of these unknowns to the researchers, as you know, we would love to collaborate on this, find out, understand these data gaps that we have. That way, in the future, we could come back to the board with perhaps a higher incentive, a higher credit than the 30 pounds. But we really feel, staff feels, that the 30 pound per acre per year credit for the implementation of this management practice is a great place to start, but we could modify it in the future.
If I may, I would like to give credit where credit's due. We do know that some growers are accounting for the nitrogen in the soil when they're doing their fertilizer nitrogen balances. We have anecdotal evidence of this and some direct evidence, but we're just not seeing it on average across our region when we look at the nitrogen applied data relative to those, the use of cover crops, to a kevel at which it's really making any difference. We need more growers to be doing that.
And Mr. Keeling, if I don't mind, I'll interject also that in certain certification programs, it is mandatory to perform soil analysis at certain intervals. So, yeah, I'm glad you clarified that. It is not a rarity. It is probably actually more common than perhaps it was indicated just a moment ago. Thank you. So I know I see hands raised again from the speakers, but I really, we can't keep going back and forth here. I want to keep this item moving. So I'm so sorry, Mr. Brennan and Ms. McCune, if I'm sort of right now bypassing your waving of the hands. I want to go back to the board to get a sense of where we want to go here now that everyone had a chance to speak. And Mr. Young, you had your hand raised about 15 minutes ago, so I'll let you start.
Thank you, Chair Wolff. So it's my understanding that farmers have not had to make the adjustment in their use of nitrogen based on what is in soil today. Is that a misunderstanding I have? But my understanding is they haven't had a regulatory requirement to actually make the adjustment. Is that correct?
That is correct. There is not a requirement that says that they have to account for the nitrogen in the soil, but it is a good best management practice.
Okay, so that's an important factor in my mind because things change when they are required to be changed or there is a high enough incentive to make that change. So, why do something if you don't have to do it? To kind of condense my thoughts on this subject right now without getting elaborate, I don't want us to foreclose at this point a pathway that allows for this 30 pounds per acre to be adjusted within the order. I don't want to see it wait for something else to happen. I think the science is there that justifies more than what might be somewhat of an arbitrary figure of 30 pounds. I'm a bit uncomfortable with that. I like the idea that it's an initial credit. Okay, that's good. I like that. But it sounds like we can really jumpstart this move if we use more science, a more science-based approach with it. So I want to see something, I would like to see something opened up in the language of the order that allows for this pathway of really using cover crops in a more scientific, systematic method to be used. I just don't want to wait, because this is going to be so laborious with its implementation, this order, that this could be something that just gets kind of pushed to the side. And I think the benefits that also go towards, getting carbon into the soil are going to be helpful, as well as mineralizing nitrogen into the soil. I think these are just really beneficial things. So, Chair Wolff, that's my comment. Let's not foreclose some type of pathway that allows for this to be developed within the order.
Thank you, Mr. Young. And Ms. Gray, and then I have another reflection on this. Thank you. Ms. Vice Chair Gray, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Wolff. I know that we had a follow-up question on ET, and I'm not sure that staff answered that, so we might want to get that looped in before we go to consensus. And I will just concur with Mr. Young's comments. I agree wholeheartedly.
All right, thank you, Ms. Gray. Personally, circling back to ET, okay, there are many tools available. So when Mr. Cahn talked about the NASA approach for semi stations, to get to the actual 15 takes a while. That's one thing we cannot do legally. We don't want to be prescriptive. So when we mention measuring ET, it needs to be understood. There are many tools in the toolbox. So I took the presentation of Mr. Michael Cahn sort of as, hey, this is the latest technology available, and that's why using ET is of good value. So personally, I don't see need to tweak or modify anything here. We use the term generically. In my last comment also is basically an echo Mr. Young's input. We, throughout the next 2 days, I think all of us need to remind ourselves that this 4.0 agricultural order is going to be work in progress. In fact, to the point where there are certain things in the tables on nitrogen limits, which today we do not have the science to do it. Okay? So we need to remind that ourselves. So it's going to be, an adaptive process. So to the point that Mr. Young made, I do agree that today is not the day to slice and dice how we're going to approach this 30 pounds. I think it's point well taken. There is a need to further continue this conversation and not close the book and say, well, 30 pound it is, that's the end of the story. The same as we will be discussing later around third-party programs where we don't have a program in place yet. So we're going to be potentially adopting an order where say, hey, we're giving a spot for third-party programs, and then third-party you'll need to come back, with your plan, and there'll be additional engagement opportunities. So I like the suggestion of Mr. Young that staff will need to further refine this, and we in the language of the order, leave the door open of having further discussion to refine this 30 pounds issue, so we don't find ourselves at 5 o'clock tonight still going back and forth on this particular item, because I think most of us, if not every one of us, agree this is a good point. This is very valid. There's a need to, revisit this. So that's my last comments, and I see Dr. Hunter's hand raised. Go ahead, Dr. Hunter.
Thank you, Chair Wolff, and I'll be as brief as possible. I agree with Mr. Young's perspective on this, and the idea that we have 6 years of total nitrogen applied data, TNA data as we refer to it, has been informative as to outlier issues in terms of over-application. And that has been tremendously valuable to us to understand practices and patterns in regard to best management practices. But I would not like to see that data limit us in potential incentives. And so my thinking is that this is an option. And in regard to the complexity of the order and this 97% or 3% discount, as Mr. Smith described it, I believe that a farmer that chooses this as an option is one that would have some background with this, perhaps working already with crop advisors, etc. So as an option, I don't see this as creating a requirement that increases the complexity of the data reported. And I believe that staff will be working with, I believe the order states that staff will be working with UC Davis in particular, and perhaps other technical science resources in looking at crop coefficients. So there are other processes going on where staff will be involved with developing numerics that we don't yet have, as you point out. So my inclination is to allow for this change. And again, it's an option. So that's my view. And as far as ET, I took the same meaning that you did, Chair Wolff, that this was additional information and actually expanded the available tools and resources and where we are with particular ones coming online, which is exactly what we hoped, that we would see technical guidance coming into play to meet the regulations and allow for this to advance where we are currently and not hold us in a status quo position. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hunter. And last here, Mr. Johnston. And then after Mr. Johnston, I'm going to ask for a concurrence of my fellow board member on what the any action will be out of this particular item. So go ahead, Mr. Johnston.
Yes, I agree with Dr. Hunter and Mr. Young on the cover crop question, at least with what I think their comments to mean, which is to support some language that allows for the incorporation of the suggestion made by the commenters of including a requirement that the cover crop have a 20-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio and removal of the 30-pound cap. I believe that's what Mr. Young and Ms. Hunter were supporting. I'm not sure, but if so, I agree with it. And secondly, while most of Mr. Cahn's talk was on new methods to calculate evapotranspiration, I don't want to lose sight of his concrete proposed change to the order, which was to say that in lieu of the evapotranspiration requirement of requirement of the crop being used to calculate the nitrogen being added by irrigation, that if less water was being put on the crop than required for evapotranspiration in situations of heavy rain or deep-rooted crops, permanent crops, that lesser number could be used. It just makes sense to me. If you're not applying the nitrogen, you shouldn't have to. You should not have to count it.
Okay, so in regard to the cover crop, what I think I heard from the rest of our fellow board members is that we would have language that we will ask staff to work on so that we don't get hung up in wordsmithing right at this moment on a real-time basis. But basically, one is, well, you can use the 30-pound, but also if you don't, you can use the alternative approach, which then will involve a process
this stuff is
that was suggested
pretty
by
messy.
Mr. Brennan. I think that's kind of
and it just kind of made me see
the sense of it. You can take the short form, or if you want to go in further detail to further enhance your credits, you can go at it. And so that's basically what I'm understanding, putting it in very simple terms here. So on this particular one, and then we'll put the ET and comment of Mr. Cahn as a separate item. So I'd like to kind of see a concurrence on this, and I saw the hand raised of Ms. Yu. So Ms. Yu, go ahead.
So I do want to note that this is just the first panel, and there is the possibility that future commenters may have different viewpoints on these particular issues. So I think while it's possible to, I think any consensus that we obtain right now, we need to consider it as preliminary, just in case something further comes along that might change your minds.
Well, everything is preliminary.
Jim already saw the video, but I'll send it to you, and I'll send you the
ultimately to.
I'll send you the live.
I'll
send you the live version as
what
well as the
staff
pre-recorded one.
is suggesting as language derived from today, and but Ms. Yu, ultimately also we're going to have to make decisions. So I want to maintain this process. If there was some incredible big change that is proposed later, we certainly will apply due diligence. But I think we need to continue applying good faith here in the process. So I appreciate the clarification, but right now, I would like to reach a concurrence on this item pertaining to the 30-pound limitation, and then providing in the language an alternative process as well to increase the potential accuracy and augmentation of the credit. So I'd like to see a concurrence of my fellow board members on this, and I will start with Mr. Young.
Yeah, I concur with the way you described it initially as an alternative pathway.
Mr. Johnston?
Yep.
Dr. Hunter?
I concur.
Vice Chair Gray?
Yes, I concur.
And I concur myself. So thank you. That will be an item for staff to review. And next item is the comments made by Mr. Cahn associated with the specifically with the amount of water used that may be less. So any further comments from fellow board members on that particular item? Do you see, do you have a suggestion to make changes? And also we haven't heard from staff. So I think it would be fair first to, get a comment from staff in regard to that item. And Mr. Keeling, who do you propose to comment?
I believe Ms. Saul is prepared to respond to that one. I think I know what her answer is going to be.
Well, let's hear from her. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Wolff and Mr. Keeling. So staff, we have reviewed Michael Cahn's proposal related to adding the additional language of crop ET or applied water, and we are supportive of that change.
All right. Well, that was an easy one. So based on the input from staff, concurrence would be to have a revision to provide that more accurate method of identifying amount of water use. And staff will work on the proposed language. So do we have a concurrence on that item? We'll start with Mr. Young again.
Yes.
Dr. Hunter?
Yes.
And Mr. Johnston?
Yep.
Ms. Vice Chair Gray?
I concur.
And I concur myself. So that wraps up this item.
This is the revision that Mr. Cahn requested and the board consensus was to include related to the A in the irrigation water definition.
He had asked that it say whichever is less. Is that necessary?
No, it's not.
Decided it wasn't.
So if it's less, they're going to use that.
You think?
The way it reads, it's almost like, I know it means the amount of nitrogen in pounds per acre, but it's kind of funny the way it reads, volume of water applied in pounds per acre. Just seems to be, I don't know.
Because you think volume is gallons and pounds is a different unit?
I think maybe what he's getting at, it might read better, is A here is the amount of nitrogen in pounds per acre applied in the irrigation water estimated from.
Yes.
More,
Yes, thank you.
Better.
yeah.
Like that.
Lovely. You want to underline yellow?
Well, why don't you replace that language that you had just deleted and strike it out so that it's...
Oh. Let me just think about how the best way to do this is.
If you right click and pull out your font, and then you can strike through it.
There we go.
Even better than we started with.
Well, we get expert at this. All right, very nice. Makes good sense like this.
This is actually a placeholder. I'm just going to delete this, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, and we will come back to the rest of this. But the R scavenge and carbon to nitrogen ratio and all of that is a lot to put on slides. So Elaine has this in a Word document.
And I sure hope, Chair Wolff, it will be as efficient as Paula has been with hers, because I will be sharing a Word document with red line strikeout.
Yeah, we know you can do it.
Okay, so here we go. There's essentially were two changes that we were going to make to this R scavenge credit. The first change that I'm going to focus on is the researchers, specifically Dr. Brennan's suggestion related to the cover crop and how we should focus on the carbon to nitrogen ratio to help calculate the nitrogen removed. So let's start here. We're going to be adding what is called an option 2, which is a cover crop calculated credit. This language in item I is the same language that we had previously, but we are now adding this language to option 2. This was also language that Dr. Brennan did agree with.
Just to confirm, Elaine, option 1 is still that just standard 30-pound per acre credit.
That's correct. Option 1 is the 30-pound per acre credit. So again, moving on option 2, when we get down to item 2I, this is where we've added in the carbon to nitrogen ratio greater than 20:1, and that's what a cover crop must have for this credit. We also, under item 3I, have stated that standard protocols will be developed by the Water Board in coordination with the researchers, and then ultimately approved by the executive officer within 18 months of order adoption to determine the nitrogen concentration in the crop material. So this was something that we did discuss with the researchers, that you know, they have the information, but they perhaps need a little bit more time to put the information into tables that would make it readily available and easy for growers to get at and determine the nitrogen concentration in their crop material. And this is essentially what we talked about, that's based perhaps on crop height. So again, we would be developing those protocols in coordination with them.
Which will be to address the concern that Mr. Young had shared also, is make sure there is a means of verifying this. So, you know, whatever methodology you're going to recommend scientifically will be used, and that'll be a way for us to be able to verify, pardon me, you know, what these values are.
Correct.
Okay.
But my concern also with this, and this came to me as I've been ruminating over this, is this could produce a credit. I mean, it's intended to produce a credit. If it works properly, it's greater than 30 pounds. And so, can someone explain to me how, if that could get up to 100 pounds from what we heard? What we also want to see is some kind of concomitant reduction in applied fertilizer. Isn't that what we're intending to get to eventually? And I think I'm concerned that that credit may get so high that we're starting to work at cross purposes with our goal. Maybe I'm confused, so I'm asking for kind of help with this.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot too. And, you know, initially I was thinking, you know, they can game it, right? They can meet their target or their limit and still apply as much, you know, fertilizer, nitrogen that maybe they're applying. But I think the trick is that as those targets decrease and we get to the limits, that A minus R calculation is going to get so tight that they are going to have to account for the nitrogen available that's left over after the cover cropping. And what they're also going to need to do is test the soil, doing nitrate quick test to see how much is there, and to back that out of their nitrogen balance calculation. I think this is just going to be kind of a matter of course associated with the adaptive management of them implementing their practices to meet those targets and limits.
So by having to account for the nitrogen in the soil, that will, you know, if that builds up, then that means there's more available for them to utilize. But are they required to utilize it?
So at this point, no.
No, we're not requiring to utilize it, but I think they're going to have to measure it and account for it so that they can utilize it to eventually meet the targets and the limits. Another thought here that had to do with this approach and this process. Oh, so we're still going to get reporting of the nitrogen applied from all the different sources of nitrogen. We're going to get the credit information and the calculation. We're also going to get the removed. We'll be able to evaluate those data to see whether or not the growers are actually accounting for the credit and the nitrogen that can be available in the soil when we look at those numbers. So what we should be seeing as their scavenge credit goes up, and that pool of nitrogen that's in the soil left over after the cover crops reincorporate, we should start seeing some incremental decrease in the amount of fertilizer nitrogen that's being applied. So we can start, this will be something that we'll look at as part of the annual updates when we start doing data analysis on the A-R reported information.
Okay, all right. And the board has discretion anyway to make adjustments in the future should something arise that we're not anticipating right now.
Yeah.
Just a comment on the use, Elaine, if you could move back up. You're using the word nitrogen fixing plants. And I thought Jean-Pierre, you and I had a discussion not too long ago where you had mentioned to me that all plants fix nitrogen to some degree. So perhaps do we define nitrogen fixing somewhere to really mean the nitrogen fixing is a legume plant?
Right.
We do in our definitions. We do.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I'm good.
That's absolutely correct, because legume implies, a much higher level of nitrogen fixing versus, the natural plant absorption of airborne nitrogen as part of its, photosynthesis, more complex process, which includes, carbon from the air, etc. Okay. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Brennan has his hand up.
But I think right now I would rather, not introduce other parties in, we're at the point where it's the staff and the board, and there's, as we clearly indicated, there's going to be opportunity here for staff to work closely with UC. And I think we need to, unless there's something grossly wrong here, don't want us to get into the weeds of all the details. This was purposely crafted this way, knowing that today we don't have the luxury of the time to work out all the details on how we're going to measure this, how we're going to calculate this. Correct?
That, and I would also mention that the information we're looking at right now is in the monitoring and reporting program. It is not in the actual order. So if it is determined, and after conversations we have with Dr. Brennan, that perhaps something about these technical details need to be modified, we can do that in coordination with the executive officer.
Yeah, and another reason would, I'm going to wear Ms. View hat here, is that as we start engaging more public comments here, then anyone else can start commenting too at this stage. Right now this is a discussion between board and staff.
Board discretion.
Yes.
I do have one comment. I'm looking at 2II. Would we want to make that carbon to nitrogen ratio greater than or equal to?
So for the purposes of how we are determining the carbon to nitrogen ratio, this is something I was going to get down to in item 4. We are using the organic fertilizer discount factor table, and that table, any carbon to nitrogen ratio greater than or equal to 15, which includes this 20:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, they get that 3% discount that Dr. Brennan was talking about. So again, we could say greater than or equal to 20 or 1, but we are using the organic fertilizer discount factor for mineralization, and that ends at a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 15.
Okay, I'm not clear on what the distinction between the two ratios are.
We're using the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the organic fertilizer discount table, which we have published and which is known, for greater than or equal to 15. So that is the number we will use for, and it makes no sense, for the carbon to nitrogen ratio of 20:1.
Okay, I thought the kind of the initial table that Dr. Brennan showed was 20:1, and they were talking about greater than or equal to.
That was his suggestion.
But he also made reference to a 15:1 ratio. There was a discussion related to that as well in his secondary comments. I guess, if we're quibbling about this, and if there are changes made, and if there is an executive officer discretion utilized, and at some point it would be good to get an update on that relatively quickly after that happens.
Well, I won't have discretion to make this change after it's adopted.
Even though it's not within the order itself.
This is in the MRP.
Oh, it
Right,
is in the
it's in the MRP.
Okay, forgive me. All right. And Ms. View, you have your hand raised.
I think that it's certainly the board's discretion whether or not to allow Mr. Brennan speak. My thought is that because this change is arising out of his comment, it may be helpful to the extent that he has clarifying comments to hear him out. The board could certainly limit the topics that are discussed at this point.
I respectfully disagree, because later on we may have other changes which were prompted by environmental groups' concerns or the ag partners' concerns. And if we allow one party, we should also allow other party. And I think at this time it is very clear and understood to all of us that as needed, the change can be made. It was just confirmed that this can be slightly modified. So I do not want to create a precedent and then later on have other parties or attorneys of other entities saying, hey, you're allowed, one person to speak, I should be allowed to speak also. I think this is not, at this stage of where we are, it is not necessary, since there is an avenue to clarify this.
Dr. Wolff, may I make a statement?
Of course.
Okay. I would ask you to reconsider that ruling, so to speak. And I want to just say that at least I consider the Dr. Brennan and Dr. Cahn and the other, researcher, these folks are more like technical advisors. They work for the government. I really don't consider them to be parties as such. I would agree with you that the stakeholders, these aren't stakeholders in my view. These are technical advisors. They're just not working for the water board. And I just think it would kind of facilitate this discussion a little bit to give them a couple of minutes. So that would be my request. But I'll go by whatever you want to do, Dr. Wolff. Fine with me.
I respect that. I'm just.
If I may, the proposed addition per Dr. Brennan's presentation is, greater than or equal to 20. So his reference later on was, a 15 as a, conservative item. And I'm happy to share my screen, but the C ratio N was greater than or equal to 20 as the proposed addition. And if we're comfortable with that, I'm fine. I also can support, giving Dr. Brennan a couple of minutes strictly to address this item so that we can move on.
Well, if this is going to get us out of the logjam, fine, but 2 minutes. And I would appreciate if we do not then start migrating to, oh, by the way, what about this item or that item? We strictly address this point, 2 minutes, that's it. That helps everyone moving along the process. I will agree to that. So let's do it.
Thank you, Dr. Wolff.
He's been transferred over as a panelist. He can unmute himself and give his comments.
And Ms. Gray, please keep track of the timer.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yep. Yes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I agree completely with what Mr. Keeling said regarding the issues with the C/N ratio. The only change I would suggest is that stay with the greater than or equal to 20. That's what I suggested. That's a very it's a very good number. It's exactly the same way, so I don't need to say anything more than that, but I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to point that out, because that's an important sticking point that we don't want to have to deal with later, So thank you very much.
25 seconds. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. Thumbs up to you. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Brennan. So, board members, any other question on the rest? Mr. Johnston.
If it makes it more scientifically defensible because it is based upon some study or another to say greater than or equal to, that's change just went in there. Okay. Yeah, I was just going to support that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Johnston. On the remaining ayes, any further question? So, Mr. Keeling.
Yes?
Next step.
Okay, well, I would say the next step is staff's recommendation for the board to consider adopting proposed resolution R3 2021-0039, certifying the environmental impact report. I'm going to have to look at the exact language here. You'll have to forgive me.
Excuse me, I hate to be a buzzkill, but I was expecting Chair Wolff to ask for any last question. Okay, all right. Pardon me, my apologies.
No worries. Go ahead.
Okay, so certifying the proposed resolution R3 2021-0039, which includes attachment A, which is the proposed general waste discharge requirements for discharges from irrigated lands, agricultural order, final environmental impact report. So that's the entire IR, 3 volumes. That resolution also includes attachment B, the CEQA findings of fact.
And do we need to specify as amended in the last hour?
That would be correct. And as amended, thank you very much. As amended with the proposed changes, the 2 proposed changes that we had to the EIR.
So at this time, including now the amendments, I will ask my colleagues if there are any additional questions or suggested additions that you would like to take a consideration before we bring this matter to a vote. I see Dr. Hunter.
Thank you. I do have a question that in my review of the monitoring reporting program on page 34, table MRP-2, which is referenced in the proposed ag order on page 28, I believe. My question is, and I have it showing, if you want me to share my screen, that makes it easier.
Which page is it?
Page 34, table MRP-2. My question concerns the listing for groundwater phase area 1 for TNA monitoring and reporting, and TNA report due March 1, so the first two columns. The second line, first two columns. My question is, for the TNA and TNA monitoring reporting period, why there's no date noted for the monitoring period. My understanding is, and there is a reference on page 3 of the monitoring reporting report, there is a footnote clarifying groundwater phase 1, area 1. However, when you look at this table, there's no qualification as to why there is no TNA monitoring reporting period identified for phase area 1, groundwater phase area 1. Shouldn't there be a date there?
Can we post this on the screen? This will help also the public seeing what we're talking about.
If I may, it sounds to me that what Dr. Hunter is referring to is the MRP for the order.
Correct.
Did you want to be discussing the EIR at this point in time, Chair Wolff?
Yes.
So,
oh, I'm sorry, did
yeah,
I? Okay.
Okay.
Well, okay. But I mean, if there's any, questions regarding the order. No, sorry.
No, sorry. My bad. My bad.
Right now we're addressing, and what has been introduced is adoption of the EIR. So, the comments should be limited to the EIR, and once we address the order, then we can bring these up. And just to close the loop, Dr. Hunter or maybe staff, when that question is brought up, it would be good to put it on the screen. That way the public can also see what you're referring to table-wise. Sounds good?
Yes.
Okay.
So unless what Dr. Hunter is bringing up could result in a change in the order, which could result in a change in the EIR. I'm just saying.
Or, hypothetically. So let's focus on the EIR. And so I will ask the fellow board members if there are any additional comments or thoughts or additions or questions that you may have at this time. And looking at any hands raised, I do not see any hands raised. So what I would like at this time is to then ask for a motion.
I'll move for adoption of resolution number R3-2021-0039.
With changes as proposed.
Yes.
And do we have a second?
I will second it.
Right. Any further comment or discussion?
This is with the understanding that it's as amended in the last hour or so.
Correct, and that was stated by Mr. Keeling. So any further question, comment, or discussion? I see none, so I would like to make a roll call.
Mr. Packard had to step out for a bit, so I will go ahead and fill in. Let's do a roll call. Chair Wolff?
Approved.
Vice Chair Gray?
Aye.
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Dr. Hunter?
Aye.
Mr. Johnston?
Yep.
That's 5-0.
All right, unanimous. Thank you very much. So the next item will be the general waste discharge requirements for discharge from irrigated land, which is order number R3 2021-0040, Agriculture Order 4.0, also known as Ag Order 4.0. And this included also revisions that have been visited just a little while ago. So at this time, I'm going to circle back to Dr. Hunter on a question that you had pertaining to a table.
Thank you. So the table I'm referencing is in the monitoring reporting program, and I believe that you wanted staff to put this table up.
Yeah,
it's on page 34, table MRP-2. While we're waiting for that, I will also comment that groundwater phase 1 areas, it is noted in the MRP earlier in the document in a footnote that groundwater phase 1 areas are not required to submit a standalone TNA report. However, when you look at this table, there's no mention of that particular qualifier for groundwater phase area 1. And when you look at the first column of that table, that column is labeled TNA monitoring reporting period. And my question is, wouldn't there be a relevant date for the monitoring reporting period, although they are not submitting they are not doing a standalone report, but they certainly have a monitoring period?
I'll answer that. So on table MRP2, the reasons that the two columns referring to TNA reporting or monitoring period and then reporting period are blank is because the intent is to go immediately under the columns for INMP monitoring period and reporting. It's to indicate that there isn't a submission of just a standalone TNA report for groundwater phase 1 areas. It goes right into the reporting of applied and removed and irrigation information in the INMP summary report.
Yes, and I realize it did. When I first looked at it, I had to go back and reread why the date was missing for groundwater area phase 1. So I did connect the dots there, but I think there's some clarification needed here, either an additional footnote to indicate why the TNA monitoring period is subsumed in the annual INMP monitoring period. It appears as though, when you look at this table, it appears as though there is no monitoring period for groundwater phase area 1. You have to know that on page 3 of the monitoring report, there's a footnote that indicates that phase 1 is not required to do a standalone report. I think it just needs some clarification.
It looks pretty clear to me that if you're in groundwater phase 1, that everybody is required under 3.0 to do their 2021-2022 TNA monitoring period, and that if you're in phase 1, you're doing INMP monitoring beginning 2023, and if you're in phase 2 or 3, you're doing TNA monitoring beginning in 2023. I'm not quite clear what the confusion is.
I accept that. I found it. I thought it was. I thought it would be helpful to have the monitoring period listed there because they are collecting the data. the way it reads to me, and I won't push it any further, but the way it reads to me is that they are collecting data, but there's no monitoring period listed. There is no explanation that in this on this page 34, there is no explanation that the INMP monitoring period incorporates TNA for groundwater phase area 1. That's where I land with it. If there's no agreement on this, that is fine. I just wanted to bring it up and make sure that we couldn't help to clarify this.
I have a question for staff that might help clarify this. So, regardless of whether you're reporting TNA or through the INMP, is the monitoring the same?
Well, the monitoring for the nitrogen applied is the same, but then you have the added monitoring associated with removal.
Removed, that's the phasing. So when you get to the INMP, that's the inclusion of the removal.
Yes.
That's the distinction.
Right. So yeah, I mean, in putting this table together this way, the intention was to indicate that for groundwater phase 1 areas, they go right into the monitoring period associated with INMP reporting, INMP summary reporting. So,
so to Ms. Quickle, to address the concerns of Dr. Hunter, perhaps in an abundance of, trying to clarify with a footnote, help address this without further complication?
We can include a footnote. Yes. I think putting that footnote right after, in the column, the first column for groundwater phase 1 area, putting a footnote there indicating that nitrogen applied monitoring is incorporated in the INMP summary report monitoring period. Does that sound reasonable?
Dr. Hunter?
Yes, that I think what I'm after is connecting what the information on page 3 in footnote number 3 of the monitoring reporting document with this table. Would I think make clear that groundwater area phase 1 will be collecting TNA data, and it will be collected during that first year. During the 2023, beginning in 2023. I just wanted to see if that information could be brought forward to the table.
So to be clear, we're saying that on the MRP-2, table -2, it would be a footnote number 4. Okay?
Yes.
All right. And you would reference paragraphs 3 and 4 on page 3 of the MRP? That's what.
Or could just repeat the language, which reads, dischargers in groundwater phase 1 areas are not required to submit a standalone TNA report, rather due to prioritization of phase 1 areas, then it goes on to name the specific basins, must conduct the expanded monitoring and reporting associated with INMP summary reporting.
So if we do that, does that add any unintended consequence, staff?
No, I think it's just a repeat of that footnote number 3. Just putting it on the table page.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. So to wrap this suggestion from Dr. Hunter, I assume someone is memorializing this as an addition to the revisions that have been proposed and referenced just a little while ago associated with this irrigated land general order. So we're good. We have that memorialized. Okay.
Yes.
Thank
you. Thank
You're
you.
welcome, Dr. Hunter. So fellow board members, any other questions, additions, comments at this time before we bring this item to a vote, which will include this latest modification of the MRP-2 table with the inclusion of footnote number 4. I'm looking at my screen. I do not see any additional comments, suggestions, so I would like then to bring this item to a vote.
So, Dr. Wolff, I'll move that we adopt order R3-2021-0040 as proposed and amended today.
All right. So do we have a second?
I will second.
All right. Any further discussion? I see none. So at this time, I would like to get a roll call for a vote.
All right. Chairman Wolff?
Approved.
Vice Chair Gray?
Aye.
Mr. Young?
Yes.
Dr. Hunter?
Aye.
Mr. Johnston?
Aye.
And motion has 5-0 passing.
All right. Thank you very much. So this vote was also unanimous, and certainly would like to congratulate everyone for bringing this item to the finishing line. You know, a lot of thanks goes to a lot of people reflecting on the journey we have gone through. You know, certainly I want to thank my fellow board members for, you know, the significant amount of efforts you have put into helping bring this item to conclusion today, and a lot of due diligence and vetting and asking tough questions. So thank you for that. Also, certainly, you know, many thanks goes to our staff for the thousands of hours that have been put into putting this order into place. The flexibility that all of you have shown. You know, I did mention that at a brief last week. I said, you know, it's not always easy when you spend a lot of time developing a complex product like this, and then having some folks says, well, I don't like this part, I don't like that part, I want you to change that part. It's not an easy thing to do, and recognize that the fact that all of you said, hey, you know, we'll make the change, we'll listen to you and adjust. And then lastly, and I think very, very importantly too, we need to have a lot of thanks to all the stakeholders, because I mean, all sides, you know, in the environmental community, the ag community, all of you who are watching and listening right now, you also have put hundreds and hundreds of hours in this. So, you know, you deserve a lot of appreciation for your dedication as stakeholders and NGOs also in, you know, helping us, making recommendations, suggestions, field trips. So very much appreciated. And then my last comment is, as I have said before, in a sense, the work has just begun, because this is going to be an adaptive process. It's going to require close collaboration of all parties, the environmental parties, the agriculture community, the scientific community, and staff and the water board. So we have put a lot of effort in constantly making reference to, hey, this is adaptive. This is work in progress. You know, the science is going to keep moving, and we're going to use the science to, you know, make progress toward these water quality improvements. So I just wanted to further reiterate that. So that's basically my summary appreciation, and certainly will welcome the opportunity for my colleagues to comment also on this, very, very special day. I mean, today is a very special day, so thank you. I'll start with Mr. Young.
Well, I echo your sentiments, Dr. Wolff. Just a tremendous effort, by everybody, as you mentioned. Staff has done just an incredible job of pulling together all of these pieces and continuing, to feed us information, graphs, having answers, having the analyses that we've asked for. It just could not have been done without such a tremendous effort by staff. And, I do want to say to Mr. Keeling, coming in as you have, it almost, I think it was midstream or early on in this process, and being able to keep the momentum going as you have with staff, I really, applaud you for that. I just think it's a great effort. And, any of these pieces in the puzzle, which is us, staff, the stakeholder involvement, and everyone else, everyone's got to really do their fair share here, and everybody really has come to the plate and given it their all. And, especially, the stakeholders, the things that they identified, the things that they brought to our attention, really just made this a very comprehensive and detailed analysis for us to go through all the time. I feel comfortable, very, very comfortable with this product. Is it perfect? No. But none of these permits of this character, of this comprehension, could be perfect. I mean, there's always going to be something that gets left out or unstated, undefined, not thought of at this juncture, but I feel comfortable with this, especially because of the years of effort that have gone into trying to get it to this point in time. So I just want to thank everybody for rolling up their sleeves and pulling this together. I feel good right now. I feel good with what we've done. So thank you all.
Thank you. So, Vice Chair Gray, I'd like to hear from you.
Sure. So, yeah, I want to just really extend my deep gratitude to everybody in the process. So firstly, for staff, as Chair Wolff mentioned, you have been working on this order for years, and you've toiled and you've, become wedded to some of these things. And it takes a lot to present them in a very structured, matter-of-fact, dispassionate fashion to us and continue to answer our questions over and over again, continue to explain things in great detail. You all have a breadth and depth and command of the issues that is really admirable. And I know that it has been probably difficult to move through some of this, not only at the pace that we have, but also getting pushed and prodded in different directions. So deep gratitude to you all, to your leadership as our executive officer, Mr. Keeling, and to my fellow board members for just being consummate professionals as well. And then obviously the stakeholders who have put in thousands of hours and who have really, in addition to their full-time jobs, really provided deep thought and suggestion and comment and engage with us again in a really professional manner. These are very difficult issues and from all facets, and so it's really gratifying to see people move forward and be invested in this. And so from the ag stakeholders to our environmental stakeholders to the public. So I just have deep gratitude for everybody involved in this process. It's been long, obviously, and it's been arduous, but thank you all, and I'm glad we're at the finish line here.
Thank you. So Dr. Hunter and Mr. Johnston. Dr. Hunter.
Thank you, Chair Wolff. And in addition to what my two colleagues have already said, and I'm guessing Mr. Johnston will echo the sentiments, I want to thank you for your vision and leadership as well. I know the hours that you've been able to devote to supporting staff and leading staff behind the scenes in between our hearing sessions, both workshops and the formal hearings that we've conducted. And I can't imagine how this process would have been completed over this period of time without that strong hand guiding staff and giving structure and organization to a very chaotic and difficult and complex process, and chaotic and complex, set of parameters and language and all of the different ways in which this order reflects our best understanding and our best science at this point, and anticipating and allowing for that adaptive approach, and your constant reminder of climate issues that are going to be confronted by stakeholders across the region in all different ways, but especially for our farmers. That is going to be a major challenge. I will say this, I think the Zoom factor has added to our hearing from various folks who I had not had a chance to meet before, and certainly that concerns our technical advisory folks and the UC research folks that have contributed to this. Typically we see their work in the form of studies and in the form of graphics and other elements that in the work product that they put out to the farmers and to others in the ag industry. And I think it has likely facilitated their ability to speak to us directly. And I think that has been a huge bonus for us. So I'm guessing that now that we have this technology and our staff is so capable in using it, that we will continue to rely on that and extend that opening to folks who are otherwise limited in their time and ability to travel to be where we are. So that is another bonus that occurred in this round. And lastly, I'm just going to say, of all the faces and all the names I was looking through today, and I see that Mr. Chris Rose has been sitting in today and watching this process come to a close. I'm sure there's a bittersweet element for him, but we have not forgotten or overlooked in any way, shape, or form his leadership in bringing this to a close. And his fine hand is apparent on this. So, and Ms. Elaine Saul in picking up the baton. I am so impressed with the leadership that you've brought forward. So thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hunter, and also our fellow board member, Mr. Johnston, who, always have consistently shown a lot of attention to details. He also helped challenge us at time when we thought, well, okay, we have this figured out, and then he'd say, well, wait a minute, you need to look at that angle. So you're also very special, Mike. So go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Wolff. And from my perspective on the 10 years I've been on this board, this whole issue has framed my entire time on the board. I came in when we had no quorum on 2.0, and it has really dominated the last 10 years. And I echo my fellow board members. Kudos to staff including Mr. Rose, including Mr. Robertson, who really helped bring us here. And I know from my own experience of being a staffer, proposing but not finally deciding on policy for many years in the organizations I worked in, how frustrating it is sometimes, because our staff is extremely knowledgeable, much or most of the time more so than us as board members, and they come up with all of these elegant solutions to issues they care about deeply, and then have us yank them sideways and say, no, we don't want to do it this way, we want to do it that way. And that is hard. And I have just been really, especially in this period down the stretch, just impressed at the work product that we've seen from the staff on such short turnaround and such quality. You know, I have a lot of trepidation about this order. I'm easily influenced, I guess you could say, and when I hear the environmentalists, and particularly the environmental justice folks, saying, hey, look, this is a problem that's only gotten worse, it's a huge threat to human health, and you're talking about deadlines that are decades in the future, I really worry about that. And then when I hear from agriculture, they're really legitimate concerns about what this will mean in a tight margin industry that is, as they rightly pointed out this morning, not just an economic but a social and cultural underpinning of the region that extends far beyond the interests of farmers. I worry about that. And I really do think that, as Chair Wolff said, that the work is just beginning, because we haven't solved this problem. You know, we've put together a framework, and I think that the issues and problems in the framework will probably start to surface fairly soon, and we'll have to figure out how to patch them and how to fix them, so there's some ways that sausage making is kind of inherently unsatisfying. I really don't think that if nobody's satisfied with it, that means we did a good job. But you know, I think we have really struggled as a staff and a board and stakeholders to come up with something here, and I'm glad we have. I'm glad, you know, we've got something to work with, we've got something to move forward with, and we're just going to have to keep working on it. So,
thank you, Mr. Johnston, and you know, definitely, you know, the value and contribution of Mr. Keeling, you know, are not unnoticed, because, you know, when he took over this position, and this is a tough order to, you know, to wear the hat of executive officer, and then you have probably one of the most complex, significant order to, you know, eventually bring to closure. And then, of course, all of a sudden, here comes COVID-19, and having to, you know, extremely disruptive on how we do business. So you handled that very, very well, with the long hours, and you know, it was showing in the last 2 days your intimate, detailed knowledge of this order. I mean, there was not a single section where, you know, you had to kind of think, oh, I'm not sure about that. You actually stepped in and say, oh, you know, there's that section. So that, I have to say, that is being very, very impressive to me. So I want to personally thank you for, you know, for doing exemplary work as the executive officer, and yet, you know, being in this position for a relatively short time. So thank you for that. And there's one more group of people that need to be appreciated, and it's the understanding of your close loved ones, your spouse, your partners, your kids. In some cases, that we had to put the long hours and delay things. And I'm saying this in regard to my fellow board members. Some of the family sacrifice that you have made, and certainly staff likewise. Some of you working from home and juggling, having to take care of family because school is closed, so you got to wear another hat. And then same thing, of course, with all of our stakeholders and some of our presenters who had to juggle these personal lives. So there's a significant impact that everyone has had in putting the efforts in getting this ag order into final completion.
Chair Wolff?
Yes.
May I add one additional group? And I think we've, again, because of Zoom, we've had so many more stakeholders participating than we might otherwise have seen. And that is our interpreters, who have helped to facilitate communication to our stakeholders who have language challenges, but who nonetheless are enduring and participating in community work to find solutions for the problems associated with drinking water, and the ability to support their understanding and enhance and expand their capacity to participate the interpretation of this highly technical discussion is one that we can't undervalue. So I really want to make sure we give a thanks to our interpreters.
Yep. Thank you for mentioning that. And as we do a 360 or reviewing all the folks who have been pivotal in helping us, I also want to express my personal appreciation to our counsel, to both Stephanie and Emil, helping us stay within our swim lane and legally speaking, and so very much appreciate your contribution. So I do not have any further pause, but look forward to continue seeing the results, the progress we're going to be making with this order, and certainly give the opportunity here for our executive officer to make a few comments as well. So Matt?
Before Matt does,
Sure.
Dr. Wolff, I just wanted to add, which I didn't, I want to add to my comments that you have done a superb job. And, being a prior chair, I know what it's like to carry the burden of trying to manage things. You're trying to manage people, the flow of information, the flow of presentations. And it's really something that when I was doing it, really took all of my focus and mental energy. Mm-hmm. And you have done a superb job. Mm-hmm. I neglected to say that, and Dr. Hunter reminded me of that. Thank you, Monica.
Sure.
And kudos, Jean-Pierre.
Thank you. A pleasure doing this, and all of you made it much easier for me because everyone is great collaborators in this process, and we all have been able in great harmony to agree on agreeing and agree on disagreeing. So thank you for your comment, Jeff. Matt.
Thank you. Yes, thanks to all of you for putting your trust in me, and thanks to staff. Couldn't have done it without you, in particular, echoing Board Member Young's comment. I could not have done this without Chair Wolff's support guidance, with a strategic back and forth and trying to figure out the best way to bring this thing home. So I echo everybody's thanks to the full spectrum of people who have been engaged in this, and I'm glad there was mention of Chris and other staff. The legacy runs deep with respect to this ag order process, and it goes back 20 years. And there's staff that the list is too long to mention, board members, and it's going to continue in the future. It's going to continue beyond all of us. It's going to have to. Yeah. I just want to make a point. Throughout this process, we've gotten a lot of support from stakeholders. We've also had a lot of dissatisfaction expressed to us, in particular the last couple of days, about the process and the outcome. And I just hope people understand how difficult our job is, what we're trying to do. Our mandate is really clear. Protect water quality and beneficial uses. That also comes with a heavy caveat that we have to consider other social and economic factors and cultural factors. And trying to balance the competing issues, viewpoints, and potential outcomes associated with addressing the really significant water quality problems that we have in our region, with the fact that agriculture is part of our culture here in the Central Coast. And we can't discount that. We got to balance those two things, and it's extremely difficult. And I think we've landed at a good balance point as best we could. We as we heard the last couple of days, on one side, doesn't go far enough. On the other side of the table, it's too far. There's a lot of tension between the things that we're trying to balance here. And I think what we've done is we've set a path. We said we've got to have some clear objectives and timelines by which we start moving towards meeting those. But we have flexibility built in, and we can and we will adjust. And we got to keep moving forward. I think, is all the work that is going to go into this every year, it's going to be really important. Those annual updates, looking at the data, hearing from the stakeholders, hearing from the researchers. But really, all of you as board members, you're the ones that really have helped us navigate that balance that we have to make in this decision, in this order. It's got to be the most difficult part of the process. Taking all the competing viewpoints, trying to balance them, and come up with something that we can live with moving forward. So I really appreciate everybody's work on this, and I'm really proud of what we've done, and we will continue to do. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everyone. So I think this will conclude our various remarks associated to the end of the very long couple of days in terms of also our mental stamina to stay on track. So at this time, I would like to conclude today's order board meeting, and we will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. So I declare this meeting closed, and today is Thursday, April 15, 2021. It is 6:32 p.m. Thank you, everyone, and see you tomorrow. Thanks again.